On the second morning of November 1883, a Korean picture bride named Soon-ok stepped off the coach at Larkspur Crossing carrying a bundle wrapped in blue cloth and nothing else the county considered a dowry. The Halloran family, who ran cattle on 11,000 acres and owned the bank besides, had arranged the match as a favor to no one, least of all her. Everyone in that yard, from the station master to the preacher's wife, agreed she had been handed a burden. The sod house on the north section, the 1-3 tenant families had already abandoned to the wind. Nobody thought she would last the winter on it. Caleb Halloran met her at the edge of his own land with his hat still on and his jaw set like a man closing a business account, not welcoming a wife. He had buried one wife already and had told his brother plainly that he expected to pay this one off by Christmas, ship her back east with her fare returned, and never speak of the arrangement again. What he did instead, the first night the temperature dropped below freezing and she refused to leave that ruined sod house for his own warm kitchen, would be talked about in Larkspur Crossing for 30 years, not as scandal, but as the story every young bride on that frontier was told to make her believe the ground could still be kind. She had learned by the age of 6 that the sound of her own voice made grown men uncomfortable in rooms where they had already decided what she was. Her mother had taught her to fold that discomfort into something useful, a bow held a half-second longer than necessary, a silence that let the other person hear their own rudeness echo back at them. It was a skill Soon-ok carried across an ocean she had not chosen to cross, tucked into the same bundle as her grandmother's ribbon and a photograph of a man she had never met, the man whose passage money had bought her a place on a boat and whose death, 3 weeks before she landed in San Francisco, had left her married to a stranger's brother instead. The broker who arranged such things had not thought this detail worth mentioning until she was already on the train west, and by then there was no fare to send her home. She stood now at the door of a house that was not a house so much as a wound cut into a low rise of prairie, sod bricks stacked and dried into walls that wept dust when the wind hit them wrong. And she understood that everyone gathered to watch her walk inside, the Hallorans' hired men, the 2 ranch hands who had lost bets on how many nights she would survive there, even the preacher's wife who had come only to see the spectacle and call it charity afterward, expected her to weep or to refuse or to turn around and beg for the train fare she did not have. She did none of it. She set her bundle on the one dry corner of the packed dirt floor and began, with the flat side of a stove lid she found propped against the wall, to knock the loose dirt from the doorframe so the door would close properly against the cold. Caleb Halloran watched this from horseback for 11 full minutes before he rode away without a word, and the 2 hands who had been laughing when she arrived stopped laughing sometime around minute 4, though neither of them could have said exactly why. The cold that first week was not the kind that announced itself with drama. It came sideways, through the seams between the sod bricks, through the gap under the door that no rag could fully block, through the thin blanket she had brought from a country where winter meant something gentler than this. She rationed the coal Caleb's foreman had grudgingly delivered, 4 sacks, dropped at her door without a greeting, clearly measured to last exactly as long as the Hallorans expected her to. She learned the rhythm of the wind before she learned the names of her nearest neighbors, learned which hour of the night it dropped low enough to sneak past the stove's reach and touch the walls themselves. On the 4th night she woke to a sound she did not recognize at first, not wind, not the house settling, but hooves, slow and deliberate, circling the sod house twice before stopping somewhere near the lean-to she used to store what little wood she had. She did not go to the window. She had already learned, in 6 years of being watched by men who believed watching gave them a claim, that the safest thing a woman could do was let them wonder whether she'd noticed. In the morning there was a second stack of wood beside her first, cut and split by someone with a practiced hand, and no note and no explanation, and when she asked the foreman about it at the well 2 days later, he only shrugged and said the boss had been out riding fence that night, and probably nothing more than happened to pass by. She did not believe in coincidences that arrived pre-split and stacked in even rows. She banked the fire that night with wood she had not earned from a man who had told the whole county he wanted her gone by Christmas, and she lay awake turning the contradiction over like a stone in her palm, unable to find the smooth side of it, unable to stop searching. Larkspur Crossing measured a woman the way it measured cattle, by what she could survive and what she could produce, and by both counts the town had already filed Soon-ok under loss before she had unpacked her bundle. The sod house on the north section had a history the station master was happy to recite to anyone who asked, and several who didn't. A German family had tried it first, 3 winters back, and left before the second frost. A widow and her son had lasted a single season before the son took a fever the townsfolk blamed, not quite fairly, on the damp that rose up through the dirt floor no matter how much straw you laid down. After that, no one had wanted the section badly enough to fight the ground for it, and Caleb Halloran, who had inherited it along with the rest of his father's holdings, had simply let it sit, a monument to bad luck that nobody rode past without slowing to look at, the way people slow to look at a house where something is known to have gone wrong. Soon OK heard the stories in pieces, translated badly by the foreman's wife, who seemed to take a strange comfort in delivering them, as though warning a woman away from her own home were a kindness. Sunoka listened to all of it without argument, because arguing with a story already fixed in people's minds only fed it, and instead spent her first week doing what her mother had done in a house half a world away when the roof leaked and no one else would fix it. She found the actual physical problem and solved that, one problem at a time, without waiting for permission or help. The dirt floor wept in one corner because the sod above it had been cut wrong, laid grass side down instead of up, so that instead of knitting into a living root mat that shed water, it rotted. She could not relay the walls herself, not before the ground froze, but she could dig a narrow channel along that corner. Lined with flat stones she carried up from the creek bed one apron load at a time, and it worked well enough that by the second week the weeping stopped. She patched the door with hide scraped soft over 3 nights by lamplight, traded from a Lakota woman named Wren Woman, who lived 2 sections over, and who Sunoka had approached, not out of desperation, but out of the plain recognition that here was another woman the town had decided to file under loss, and 2 such women had more use for each other than either had for the town's opinion of them. Word of the trade reached Caleb secondhand, the way most things about her reached him, filtered through a foreman who did not know what to make of a bride who mended her own house instead of waiting for her husband to notice it was falling down. He rode out to look at the channel she'd dug, the patched door, the neat stack of stones still left over by the creek path, and said nothing to her directly, but that evening a length of good rope and a hand axe appeared on her doorstep, and this time she did not pretend not to know where they had come from. The rope and the axe were not an apology. Caleb Halloran did not, as far as anyone in Larkspur Crossing had ever witnessed, apologize for anything, least of all an arrangement he had agreed to only because his brother owed a debt to the broker who'd made it, and Caleb, in a rare fit of family loyalty, had let himself be talked into inheriting the obligation. He had told Sunoka as much on the second day, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands out of habit rather than courtesy, that he did not intend to be a husband to her in any sense beyond providing the coal and the deed to the section, and that once he judged her capable of surviving alone or unwilling to try, he would arrange her passage back to whatever port she preferred. It was, he seemed to believe, a generous offer. Sunoka had answered him only with a bow held a half-second too long, the old skill surfacing without her quite deciding to use it, and watched something flicker across his face that she filed away without naming. Not quite embarrassment, not quite something else. 3 weeks later, that flicker had not returned, but the small deliveries had not stopped either. A sack of dried apples left with no comment, a length of good wool blanket that smelled of cedar storage, clearly taken from some chest in the main house rather than bought new. She began to understand, slowly and without being told, that Caleb Halloran communicated in the only language he trusted, objects placed where a person would find them, problems solved before they were spoken aloud, because words, in his experience, were the currency men used to make promises they had no intention of keeping, and he would rather be thought cold than be caught lying. This was not comfort exactly. It did not undo the 11 minutes he had sat his horse and watched her clean a doorframe without offering to help, or the flat instruction he'd given the foreman that she was to receive exactly 4 sacks of coal and no more. But it was information, and Sunoka had spent her whole life surviving on less information than this, reading the true shape of a household from smaller clues than a stack of firewood cut to match her exact need. She started, without deciding to, watching him the way she had once watched her own father, not for signs of danger, though she kept those instincts sharp too, but for the particular quality of a man's silence, the difference between a silence that hid nothing and one that was doing all the work his mouth refused to do. The Halloran family gathered for Sunday dinner on the second week of December, a tradition Caleb's mother had kept alive since her husband's death out of something between habit and defiance, and this particular Sunday she had decided, without consulting Caleb, that his new wife would attend. The invitation arrived by way of the foreman's wife, delivered with the particular relish of a woman who suspected the dinner would not go well and did not want to miss reporting on it afterward. Sunok wore the one dress she had brought that still fit properly, dark wool with her grandmother's ribbon worked into the collar where it would not be immediately obvious to anyone who did not already know to look for it, and walked the 3 miles to the main house rather than wait for a wagon no one had offered to send. She arrived with mud on the hem and her hands raw from the cold and was met at the door by Caleb's sister-in-law, a woman named Prudence Halloran, who had married into the family 2 years prior and had spent every day since deciding who belonged in it and who did not. Prudence looked at the mud and the ribbon and the raw hands and said, loud enough for the parlor to hear, that she supposed Caleb couldn't be blamed for economizing on a wife the way he economized on everything else, and the room laughed the particular laugh of people who have decided in advance that laughing costs them nothing. Sunok did not flush, did not stammer, did not do any of the things the room seemed prepared to enjoy. She removed her coat, folded it over her arm with the precision of a woman who had once managed a household 4 times this one's size, and said in English, carefully practiced over 3 weeks of near silence, that she supposed a woman who judged guests by the state of their hem had never walked 3 miles to honor an invitation, and she hoped Prudence's own hem stayed clean enough to satisfy whatever standard she was measuring by. The silence that followed had teeth in it. Caleb, who had been standing near the fireplace with a glass he had not touched, made a sound that might have been a laugh choked down at the last second, and crossed the room to pull out the chair beside his own, the seat that had been left conspicuously, deliberately empty at the far end of the table, and said only that his wife would sit here, where he could hear her when she spoke, because apparently she had things worth saying that this family hadn't had the sense to ask for. Nothing about the rest of that dinner was comfortable, but comfort had never been the point. Prudence sat rigid through the soup course, spots of color high on her cheeks, and made 2 further attempts at the kind of remark that had worked so well before Caleb's interruption, both of which landed in a silence he made no effort to fill on her behalf. Caleb's mother, a narrow woman named Agatha, who had buried a husband and watched 2 sons scatter across 3 territories, studied Sunok across the table with an attention that felt less like judgment than like arithmetic, as though she were recalculating a sum she'd assumed was settled. She asked, halfway through the meat course, whether it was true that Sunok had traded with the Lakota woman on the Miller section, and when Sunok answered plainly that she had, and that Wren woman's hide work was finer than anything sold in the dry goods store in town, Agatha said only that her late husband had traded with the same family for 20 years, and had always said the same thing, and something in her face loosened by a degree that no one else at the table seemed to notice. It was a small thing. It would not undo 3 weeks of the county's certainty that this marriage was a mistake, dressed up as an arrangement, would not erase the bet the ranch hands had made about how many nights she'd last, would not change the 4 sacks of coal that had been measured out like a sentence. But small things, Sunok had learned long before she ever saw the inside of a ship bound for California, were what actual change was built from, 1 stone carried up from a creek bed at a time. She walked home in the dark that night with Caleb beside her, the wagon he had finally offered left unused because she preferred, she told him, to feel the ground under her own feet after a room like that, and he did not argue, only walked at her pace and said nothing for the better part of 2 miles. Until, near the fence line that marked the edge of the north section, he said, without looking at her, that his mother did not offer that kind of approval twice in a year, and that Sunok should understand what she'd been given, because he intended to say nothing further about it. January arrived with a storm that the old-timers in Larkspur Crossing would still be measuring other storms against a decade later. It came down from the north with almost no warning, a wall of white that swallowed the horizon in the space of an afternoon. And every rancher within 30 miles spent the hours before it hit doing the same frantic arithmetic. How many head of cattle could be moved to shelter? How much wood was already split and stacked within reach? How many structures could be trusted to hold against wind that would, by nightfall, be strong enough to peel shingles from a roof like skin from a fruit? Sunok had learned enough about this land by now to read the sky herself, and she spent the morning hauling every scrap of wood she owned inside the sod house, packing the door seam with the last of her rags, and filling every vessel she had with water before the well pump could freeze solid. She did not think of sending for help. She had spent 3 months proving, stone by stone and repair by repair, that she did not require rescue, and some stubborn part of her, the same part that had held a bow a half-second too long in 100 rooms designed to make her feel small, refused to be the first to break that pattern now, even as the wind began to scream through the seams of the walls with a sound she had never heard a house make before. The storm hit its worst around midnight, and it was somewhere in that howling dark, with the lamp guttering and the walls themselves seeming to breathe under the pressure of it, that she heard the pounding at her door. Not wind, not the house settling, but a fist, and a voice she recognized shouting her name with an urgency that cut through even the storm's noise. She hauled the door open against the wind's full weight to find Caleb Halloran half frozen on her doorstep, his horse nowhere in sight, having apparently left it somewhere it could find its own shelter, and walked the last half-mile on foot when the animal refused to go further into the storm. He did not explain himself beyond saying that he had not been able to stop thinking about whether her door would hold, and that he would rather freeze walking to find out than sit warm in his own house not knowing. She pulled him inside and shut the door against a wind that seemed personally offended by the interruption, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the storm doing all the talking that either of them might otherwise have needed to do. They sat through the worst of the storm on opposite sides of the small stove, close enough to share its heat and far enough to preserve whatever fiction either of them still needed about the nature of the arrangement between them, and it was there, with the wind trying its level best to find every gap in the walls, that Caleb told her, without being asked, about the wife he had buried 2 winters before Sunoke's boat had ever left port. Her name had been Ruth, and she had died of a fever that took 11 days to finish its work, 11 days during which Caleb had ridden 40 miles twice to fetch a doctor who could do nothing either time, and had sat beside her bed on the 12th night when there was nothing left to do but watch, and had made, in the raw hours after she stopped breathing, a promise to himself that he repeated now to Sunoke, in a voice stripped of all its usual flatness, that he would never again let himself want someone the way he had wanted Ruth to live, because wanting that badly, and losing anyway, was a debt he did not have it in him to pay twice. It explained, in a single unbroken confession delivered to the stove more than to her, everything that had confused her since the day she arrived, the coldness that was not cruelty so much as armor, the 4 sacks of coal measured out by a man protecting himself from his own capacity to care, the insistence that she should expect nothing from him because expecting nothing was the only safety he knew how to offer either of them. Sunoke listened without interrupting, the way she had learned to listen to her own mother's hardest stories, and when he finished, she did not offer comfort in the shape he might have expected, no soft assurance that things would be different this time. She told him instead, plainly, that she had crossed an ocean already grieving a man she had never met, promised to a stranger by a broker's contract, and had learned that grief and fear made poor architects, that a house built entirely to keep pain out eventually kept everything else out too, including whatever warmth might have found its way in on its own. He looked at her for a long moment across the small stove's light, and something in his face that had been closed since she'd first seen it in that stagecoach yard opened, just slightly, just enough that she noticed, and neither of them spoke again until the wind began, sometime near dawn, to finally lose its voice. The storm broke by mid-morning into a stillness so complete it felt like the land itself was holding its breath, and Caleb walked out into 3 feet of new snow to find his horse exactly where he'd left it, sheltered in a stand of cottonwoods a half-mile back, patient and unbothered in the way animals often are about things that terrify the humans who own them. He did not leave immediately. He spent the better part of that day digging a path from Sunoke's door to the woodpile, and then, without her asking, to the well, working with the kind of grim thoroughness she was coming to recognize as his particular love language, the one built entirely from labor rather than words. She brought him tea in the early afternoon, made from dried herbs Wren woman had traded her weeks before, and he drank it standing in the snow with his breath clouding around the cup, and told her, in the same flat voice he used for everything that mattered to him, that he would be sending a proper stove out from town before the week was through, and additional coal, and that he did not want to hear any argument about it. She did not argue. She had learned enough by now to recognize when a gift was actually an apology wearing practical clothes, and to accept it in the spirit it was given rather than the spirit that would have let her pride refuse it. Word of the night, Caleb Halloran had walked half a mile through a killing storm to check on his picture bride, reached Larkspur Crossing within 2 days, carried by the same gossip network that had once carried bets about how many nights she'd survive. And this time, the story arrived with a different shape to it, a story that made Prudence's dinner table remarks sound smaller in the retelling than they had felt at the time. Agatha Halloran, hearing the account from her own son with more detail than he usually offered about anything, said only that she had wondered how long it would take him to notice what was standing in front of him, and that she had begun to suspect the answer might finally be arriving. Soon OK, unaware of exactly how much had shifted in the county's accounting of her, only knew that the sod house felt warmer that week than the calendar had any right to allow, and that she had started, without quite deciding to, listening for the particular sound of a horse she now recognized before it ever came into view. The new stove arrived on a Thursday, hauled out on a flatbed wagon by two of Caleb's hands under instructions so specific: exact placement, exact clearance from the walls, a chimney pipe cut to a length one of the men grumbled had taken Caleb 3 separate trips to town to get right, that soon OK understood, without being told, that he had thought about this installation longer than he would ever admit aloud. The coal that came with it was not 4 sacks but 12, stacked along the north wall where the wind hit hardest, and tucked into the last sack, wrapped in oilcloth to keep the damp off, was a small bundle of silk thread in 5 colors, the kind used for the embroidery work her mother had taught her before the broker's contract had ended that instruction early. She had mentioned it exactly once, in the storm-bound dark of that long January night, a single sentence about the unfinished hem of a jacket she'd left behind in Korea, and Caleb had apparently carried that sentence with him into town and translated it, through channels she couldn't begin to guess at, into 5 spools of silk thread sourced from a supplier that likely didn't exist within 200 miles of Larkspur Crossing. She sat with the thread in her lap for a long while after the hands had gone, turning the small bundle over in her hands the way she had once turned over the contradiction of a woodpile that arrived pre-split with no explanation, except this time there was no contradiction left to solve, only a plain fact settling into place, that a man who claimed to want nothing had spent considerable effort and no small amount of money finding the one thing that might make a stranger's house feel, for the length of an evening's needlework, like home. She began that night on a small piece, not the unfinished jacket she'd left behind and could not recover, but something new, a border pattern her grandmother had taught her worked in the same 5 colors, stitched into a scrap of muslin meant for nothing in particular, except the simple exercise of making something beautiful in a house that had, for its first difficult months, offered her nothing but survival. Caleb found her at it 3 days later when he rode out with no particular excuse beyond checking the new stove's draw, and stood in the doorway watching her hands move for longer than either of them acknowledged, before he said, quietly, that his mother had asked whether Sunoke might consider coming to Sunday dinner again, this time not out of obligation but because Agatha had specifically requested her company. Spring did not arrive gently that year, and neither did the reckoning that came with it. The thaw brought mud deep enough to swallow a wagon wheel to the axle, and it brought, on a market day in late March, a confrontation Sunoke had known was coming since the day she'd first stepped off the coach, though she could not have said exactly which shape it would take. She had ridden into Larkspur Crossing alone, Caleb occupied with a cattle count on the far section, to trade eggs and the last of her preserved goods for salt and needles, and she was standing at the counter of the dry goods store when Prudence Halloran's younger cousin, a sharp-tongued young woman named Delphine who had married into money and never let anyone forget it, made a remark to her companion just loud enough to carry, wondering aloud how much longer Caleb intended to keep his imported wife, before he tired of the novelty and sent her back where such novelties belonged. The store went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone present has decided to watch rather than intervene, and Sunoke felt the old instinct rise in her, the bow held too long, the silence that let cruelty hear itself. Except this time, before she could deploy either, another voice answered from the doorway, low and even and entirely without heat, informing Delphine that she was welcome to repeat that opinion to Caleb Halloran's face, since he happened to be standing directly behind her and had heard every word of it clearly. Delphine's companion went the color of old snow. Caleb had not, in fact, been occupied with the cattle count at all. He had finished early and ridden in to meet Sunoke for the trip home, and he crossed the store now with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had decided long before he opened his mouth exactly what he intended to say, and told the room, in a voice that reached every corner of it, that his wife had spent the winter proving herself more capable than half the ranchers in this county, that she had saved his own life during the January storm, by having the sense to keep a house standing when he'd been fool enough to walk half a mile through it, and that anyone who wished to discuss where she belonged was welcome to discuss it with him directly, at length, and at whatever volume they preferred. The ride home was quiet in a different register than their silences had ever been before. Not the guarded quiet of two strangers measuring each other's distance, but something that had settled, unspoken, into a shared understanding. Soon-Ok did not thank him for what he'd said in the store, because she had learned by now that thanking Caleb Halloran for doing what he believed was simply correct tended to embarrass him more than the original act had cost him, and instead she asked, as they crossed the last rise before the north section came into view, whether he had truly meant what he'd said about the storm, that she had saved his life rather than merely sheltered him from it. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, and then he said, in the flat voice that she had learned by now to listen through rather than around, that he had walked out into that storm, half convinced he was walking toward his own death, and had found, instead, a reason to keep walking, and that the difference between those two things was not small, and that he had not fully allowed himself to name it as gratitude until he heard himself defending her in a room full of people who had spent a winter deciding she did not deserve defending. It was the closest he had come, in 5 months of marriage, to saying aloud what his actions had been saying since the woodpile appeared outside her door in November, and Soon-Ok, riding beside him with the mud-churned fields turning gold in the late afternoon light, felt something in her chest loosen that she had been holding tight since the day the broker's letter arrived, informing her that her intended husband was dead and his brother would serve in his place. She had crossed an ocean prepared to survive a stranger. She had not prepared herself for the possibility of being seen by one, actually seen, past the ribbon in her hair and the accent in her English, and the bet the ranch hands had made about her, seen the way Caleb had apparently been watching her since November, without either of them naming it. And the unfamiliarity of that feeling frightened her nearly as much as the storm had, though for entirely different reasons she was not yet ready to examine too closely in the fading light of a ride that felt, for the first time, like it was carrying her towards something rather than away from everything she'd lost. Prudence Halloran did not accept defeat easily, and the story of the dry goods store, rather than settling the question of Soon-Ok's place in the family, seemed only to sharpen Prudence's determination to prove herself right eventually, if not immediately. She found her opening in May, when a letter arrived at the main house from a cousin in Denver mentioning, almost in passing, that picture bride arrangements were increasingly being investigated by territorial authorities for fraud, particularly in cases where the woman's intended husband had died before the marriage could be properly registered, and Prudence carried this letter to Agatha with the particular energy of a woman who has found a weapon and cannot wait to test its edge. She argued, in a family meeting Soon-Ok was not invited to but heard about within the day from a sympathetic kitchen girl, that the marriage between Caleb and Soon-Ok might not be legally sound at all, given that the original contract had named a dead man, and that the family ought to consider, quietly and before any scandal could attach itself to the Halloran name, whether an annulment might not be the cleanest solution for everyone involved. Agatha, according to the kitchen girl's account, had let Prudence finish her entire argument without interruption, and had then asked her, in a voice gone very cold, whether she intended to be the one to explain to Caleb why his mother had spent an afternoon investigating ways to remove a woman who had kept him alive through the worst storm the county had seen in a decade, and whether Prudence's own marriage, arranged rather more conventionally but for reasons Agatha was fully prepared to enumerate if pressed, was really the standard by which she wished the family's unions to be judged. The meeting ended shortly after that, and Prudence did not raise the subject again in Agatha's hearing, but Soon-Ok understood, when the story reached her, that the danger had not passed so much as gone quiet, the way the January storm had gone quiet in its final hour before breaking entirely, and that a woman with money and a grudge and a piece of paper suggesting legal uncertainty was not the kind of threat that simply lost interest and wandered away. She said nothing of it to Caleb. She had already decided, somewhere in the weeks since the dry goods store, that she would rather face whatever came next standing beside him with full knowledge than protected by him through ignorance, but she had not yet found the moment, or the courage, to tell him she knew. The moment found her instead on a warm evening in early June when Caleb came to the sod house, her house, though by now the distinction between hers and his had blurred in ways neither of them had formally acknowledged, carrying a folded paper of his own and an expression she had not seen on him before, something between anger and fear that sat strangely on a face she had come to associate with careful stillness. He had heard from his mother directly rather than through the county's gossip network about the letter from Denver and Prudence's argument for annulment, and he had ridden straight from that conversation to Sunoke's door with the particular urgency of a man who has just understood how close he came to losing something without ever being given the chance to fight for it. He told her, standing in her doorway with the folded paper still in his hand, that he had gone directly from his mother's parlor to the county recorder's office and filed papers of his own, not an annulment, but a formal re-registration of their marriage under his own name as the surviving party to the original contract, witnessed and sealed in a way that left no ambiguity for any territorial authority or grasping relative to exploit, and that he had done it not because he was required to, but because he wanted the record to say, permanently and beyond argument, that he had chosen her, deliberately and with full knowledge of every complication attached to the choosing. It was, for a man who communicated primarily through woodpiles and silk thread, the most words he had ever spoken to her at once, and Sunoke, standing in the doorway of a house that 3 families had abandoned and the whole county had once been certain would break her too, found that she had no bow to hold a half-second too long, no careful silence to deploy, only the plain and unguarded fact of her own relief, which she let show on her face for the first time since she had stepped off that coach 7 months before, watching something in Caleb's careful stillness finally, fully give way in response. It was Wren Woman who finally told Sunoke the fuller story of Ruth on an afternoon in July when the 2 women sat shelling early peas on the shaded side of the sod house, because Wren Woman had lived on this land long enough to have watched the whole of it unfold and had decided, in her own time and for her own reasons, that Sunoke had earned the fuller account. Ruth Halloran had not simply died of a fever, Wren Woman explained, working her hands steadily through the pea pods as she spoke, but had died carrying a child that died with her, in a labor that went wrong in ways the 40-mile doctor arrived too late to correct, and Caleb had been the one to deliver the news to his own mother, and had been the one, in the raw weeks afterward, to dig the second small grave beside the first with his own hands, rather than let anyone else near either of them. He had not spoken Ruth's name aloud in company for 2 years after that, Wren Woman said, and the whole county had learned, without ever being told directly, that certain subjects simply were not raised around Caleb Halloran, that his silences on the matter were not coldness so much as a door he had welded shut from the inside. Sunoke sat with this information for a long moment, the peas forgotten in her lap, understanding now with a fuller weight the shape of the confession he had given her that January night by the stove, understanding too why he had chosen that particular storm-bound dark to finally speak it, when the walls themselves seemed to be testing whether they would hold. She understood as well something about the child neither of them had yet spoken of directly, though she had begun to suspect, in the 6 weeks since her own body had started keeping a secret, even she was only beginning to trust, that the conversation could not be delayed much longer. She had told no one, not even Wren Woman, though she suspected the older woman's sharp eyes had already guessed, and she found herself now turning over the question of how to tell a man who had buried a wife and a child in the same week, whether he could survive the possibility, however healthy and however wanted, of loving someone enough to lose them twice. She chose a Sunday evening to tell him, the 2 of them sitting on the rough bench Caleb had built outside the sod house door back in April, watching the light go long and gold across land that had, by midsummer, stopped feeling like a punishment and started feeling like something closer to a life. She told him plainly, without preamble, because she had learned that Caleb received plain things better than careful ones, that she believed herself to be carrying a child, likely due sometime in the depth of winter, and she watched his face carefully as she said it, prepared for the door Wren Woman had described, the one welded shut from the inside, to slam closed again in front of her. Instead, she watched something more complicated cross his features, fear and hope tangled together so tightly that for a moment he could not seem to separate them enough to speak, and when he finally did, his voice came out rougher than she had heard it, admitting that he had been afraid of exactly this since the night of the storm. Not afraid of a child itself, but afraid of the particular vulnerability a child would demand of him, the reopening of a door he had spent 2 years welding shut with his own hands, and that he did not know yet whether he had it in him to walk through that door again without the walking destroying him. Sunoke took his hand then, roughened by 2 years of that same welding work, and told him what she had come to understand in her own life, crossing an ocean toward a dead man's obligation, and finding, instead, a living one worth choosing, that a person could build a house strong enough to keep grief out only by keeping everything else out with it, and that she had not survived a broker's contract and a county's certainty and a killing January storm in order to raise a child alone inside walls that refused to open. She was not asking him to promise nothing would ever go wrong, she said. She was asking him to choose. The way he had chosen to file papers at the recorder's office, the way he had chosen to defend her in a room full of people who expected him to stay silent, to walk toward this new uncertain thing with her, rather than retreat from it, and to trust that whatever came, they would face it as a house relaid on solid ground, rather than as two separate structures, standing accidentally close together. The weeks that followed carried a fragility neither of them named aloud, but both of them tended, carefully, the way Sunoke had once tended a weeping corner of dirt floor stone by stone. Caleb began accompanying her more often when she rode into town, not out of the watchful suspicion of those early months, but out of something gentler, a wish to be near enough to catch her if the ground proved uneven. And Agatha, informed of the pregnancy in August, arrived at the sod house within 2 days with a wagon full of linens and the particular brisk efficiency of a woman determined to be useful in ways her son's careful reticence made difficult for him. Prudence, hearing the news through the same gossip channels that had once carried her own attempted annulment, made no further public remarks, though Sunoke caught her once, at a harvest gathering in September, watching from across the yard with an expression that might, in a kinder woman, have resolved into something like envy, and might, in Prudence, simply have been the slow arithmetic of a person recalculating a sum she had gotten wrong twice now and was beginning to suspect she would never get right. It was at that same harvest gathering that Caleb, standing beside Sunoke with one hand resting lightly at the small of her back in a gesture he would not have permitted himself in public even a month before, was approached by the county assessor with news that shifted the ground beneath the whole arrangement one final time. The north section, the sod house land 3 families had abandoned, and the whole county had written off as worthless, sat, according to a mineral survey commissioned the previous spring for unrelated reasons, atop a vein of good coal thick enough to be worth more than the rest of the Halloran holdings combined, a fact that meant the very ground everyone had once considered Sunoke's burden and her exile was about to become, through no design of her own, the most valuable land in the county, deeded to her directly under the marriage papers Caleb had filed that June. News of the coal vein moved through Larkspur Crossing faster than the January storm had, and it moved with a particular kind of irony that even the least observant residents of the county could not fail to notice, that the sod house land, the Section 3 families had fled, and the whole town had considered a punishment worth pitying, now belonged, by the plainest reading of the law, to the very woman they had spent a winter certain wouldn't last past Christmas. Sunoke felt no triumph in the discovery, or none that she allowed herself to indulge for more than a private, quiet moment standing alone at the edge of the section where the survey markers had been driven into the earth. She thought instead of Wren woman, who had traded hide work for a stranger's friendship before that stranger owned anything worth trading for, and of Agatha, whose approval had come before any hint of coal, earned through arithmetic that had nothing to do with money, and of the 2 ranch hands who had made their bet about her survival back in November and had, by now, quietly and without ceremony, stopped collecting on it. She thought, too, of the version of herself who had stepped off that coach 7 months before, prepared only to endure, and understood that the coal vein changed the county's accounting of her worth but had not created the worth itself, which had been there all along, in the stone channel dug by hand, in the door patched with traded hide, in the plain refusal to leave a ruined house simply because everyone expected her to fail at saving it. Caleb, for his part, wanted nothing to do with the money beyond what would secure their child's future and repair the sod house properly before winter came again, and told the assessor plainly that the land was his wife's by law and would remain in her name regardless of what the marriage papers might have allowed him to claim otherwise. A decision that reached Prudence within the week and settled, finally and completely, whatever argument she had once hoped to win. Sunoke stood that evening at the same doorway where she had first set down her bundle in November, one hand resting now on the small, undeniable curve of her own body, and understood that the ground beneath her feet, once considered worthless by everyone but her, had become the very thing the whole county now envied, and she was not yet certain what to do with the strange, unfamiliar weight of being envied rather than pitied. The winter that followed arrived early and hard, but it arrived on a house transformed almost beyond recognition from the ruin Sunoke had first walked into 14 months before. Caleb had spent the autumn rebuilding the sod walls properly, grass side up as they should have been laid from the start, working alongside 2 hired men and, on several stubborn afternoons, alongside his own mother, who had taken to arriving with tools and opinions in roughly equal measure. The new stove drew clean and steady, banked high with coal from a vein that had, within months, made the Halloran name synonymous with a kind of quiet prosperity the county had not expected from land it once considered cursed. Sunokay's time came in the deep cold of January, almost exactly 1 year from the storm that had first shown her Caleb's true shape beneath his careful stillness, and the labor was long and frightening in the particular way. All such labors are frightening. But the doctor arrived this time with hours to spare rather than too late, summoned by a rider Caleb had stationed in town for 2 full weeks in advance, rather than risk the 40-mile gap that had cost him everything once before. The child, a daughter, arrived healthy and loud in the small hours of the morning, and Caleb, who had stood outside the door for the worst of it with his hands pressed flat against the wood, as though he could hold the house together through sheer will, was permitted inside within minutes of her first cry. And Sunokay watched him cross the room to look down at his daughter with an expression that finally, fully, matched the tenderness his actions had been offering since the night of that first storm, the welded door standing open at last and nothing behind it but relief. They named her Grace, a name that satisfied both the English the county spoke and the meaning Sunokay's own mother would have recognized, and word of the birth traveled through Larkspur Crossing with none of the pity or speculation that had once accompanied every piece of news about the sod house bride. Only genuine warmth, the kind that comes when a community has watched a story resolve in a way it did not expect, and finds itself grateful to have been wrong. By March, the county's account of the sod house had changed so thoroughly that newcomers arriving in Larkspur Crossing, hearing the story secondhand from a station master who told it now with obvious pride, rather than the old relish for tragedy, could hardly credit that the same low rise of prairie had once been considered a punishment. The house itself stood rebuilt and solid, its walls laid true, its stove drawing clean, its shelves lined with preserved goods and Wren woman's finest hidework, and a growing collection of Sunokay's embroidery, the silk thread border pattern finally finished and framed above the mantel where every visitor could see it. Agatha visited weekly now, arriving with a wagon and no pretense that her errand was anything but wanting to hold her granddaughter, and even Prudence had softened by degrees too small to name individually, but unmistakable in some, bringing a christening gift in February that Sunokay accepted with the same grace she had once used to end an argument in a dry goods store, understanding that some peace did not need to be discussed to be real. The 2 ranch hands who had once bet on her failure had, by spring, become the 2 men Caleb trusted most with the coal operation, and both had, separately and without prompting, apologized to Sunokay in the awkward sideways manner of men unused to admitting error, and both had been forgiven with the same plain generosity she had shown the whole county from the day she first knocked dust from a doorframe, rather than weep in front of an audience that wanted tears. Caleb himself had changed in ways visible to anyone who had known him before the storm. He laughed now, rarely but genuinely, and Sunokay had caught him more than once simply watching his daughter sleep with an unguarded softness that would have been unimaginable in the man who had once told a stranger he expected to pay her off by Christmas and never think of the arrangement again. The welded door he had carried inside himself for 2 years stood permanently open now, and what had come through it was not the catastrophe he had feared but something closer to the life he had once believed himself unworthy of rebuilding. In April, a full year and a half after Sunokay had first stepped off a coach, carrying nothing the county considered a dowry, Larkspur Crossing held its annual spring social, the same gathering where, the previous year, she had stood at the edge of every conversation, while the town decided in whispers how long her marriage might last. This year, Agatha insisted she stand at the center of it and arranged, with the quiet determination of a woman who had come to consider Sunokay as much her daughter as any child born to her, for the gathering to double as a christening celebration for Grace, drawing nearly the whole county to a single lawn to watch a ceremony that would have been unthinkable 18 months before. Sunokay stood that afternoon in a dress of her own making, the silk thread finally used for something more than a framed scrap of muslin, worked now into a collar that married the 2 halves of her life as plainly as the ribbon she still wore, quietly, pinned inside rather than displayed, a private thread connecting her to a mother and a country she had not seen in 2 years and might not see again, but which she carried forward now not as grief but as inheritance, something to be given to her own daughter in time. Caleb stood beside her with Grace in his arms, greeting neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid conversation with his wife, and now lingered to admire his daughter and compliment the coal operation that had become, in 18 months, the backbone of the county's prosperity. Delphine, the sharp-tongued cousin from the dry goods store, approached late in the afternoon with an expression caught somewhere between apology and calculation, offering congratulations phrased carefully enough to avoid acknowledging her own earlier cruelty, and Sunoke accepted the words with the same bow, held exactly the correct length this time, that she had once used as armor, and now used, simply, as grace. She thought, watching the gathering spread across land that had once been the emptiest, most pitied section in the county, of the woman who had stepped off that coach prepared only to survive, and understood how far that woman had traveled without ever leaving this single stretch of Wyoming prairie. That evening, after the last wagon had rolled away down the muddy lane and Grace had finally settled into an exhausted sleep, Caleb and Sunoke sat together on the bench outside their door, the same bench where she had told him the previous summer that she was carrying a child, and looked out at land transformed by 18 months of stubborn, unglamorous work into something neither of them could have predicted the day she arrived. He told her then, in the plain, unhurried voice she had come to recognize as his truest one, that he had ridden out that first November morning to meet her stagecoach, fully intending to keep the promise he'd made himself after Ruth, to feel nothing, to want nothing, to treat the arrangement as a debt to be settled and closed, and that watching her clean that doorframe for 11 silent minutes had been the first crack in a wall he had spent 2 years believing was permanent. Sunoke told him in turn about the 6-year-old girl who had learned to hold a bow a half-second too long, and how she had carried that same careful armor across an ocean expecting to need it for the rest of her life, and how strange and unfamiliar it still felt, some mornings, to wake in a house where she no longer needed it at all. Neither of them spoke of the coal, or the county's changed opinion, or the christening gifts still stacked inside waiting to be put away, because none of it mattered as much, in that quiet hour, as the plain fact of two people who had been told, separately and by different cruelties, that they were finished with hoping for more than mere survival, sitting together now on solid ground they had rebuilt themselves, stone by stone and silence by silence, into something the whole county had once called impossible and now simply called home. The wind moved gently over the wheat-gold grass, nothing like the killing storm of that first winter, and somewhere inside the rebuilt walls their daughter slept warm through a night that, had anyone asked the county 18 months before, they would have sworn could never belong to this house, on this land, to this particular woman nobody had expected to last the season.